One of the most beloved fathers in American television history died in the middle of shooting a season, and the network had to figure out, in real time, how to tell millions of grieving viewers without ever using the word "died" on air. That was the reality behind The Waltons, a show remembered for its gentleness but built, behind the scenes, on a series of genuine hardships that no publicity department could fully soften. CBS's drama about the Walton family surviving the Great Depression in rural Virginia ran from 1972 to 1981, and for 9 seasons it functioned less like ordinary television and more like a weekly visit from relatives audiences had never met but somehow already loved. So when the actors playing those relatives began disappearing from the screen, one by one, for reasons ranging from mortality to motherhood to burnout, viewers didn't experience it as typical cast turnover. They experienced it as loss. Understanding why each of these performers actually left requires setting aside the soft-focus nostalgia the show is remembered for and looking instead at the very real lives unfolding just off camera. Will Geer's departure remains the most sobering of them all because it was never a departure in the conventional sense. Geer played Grandpa Zebulon Walton, the tree-loving, folk-wisdom-dispensing patriarch whose presence gave the show much of its philosophical warmth. He died on April 22, 1978, at age 76, following complications connected to respiratory illness, while the series was still in active production. What audiences may not have fully appreciated at the time was that Geer's own life story was far more dramatic than anything scripted for Grandpa Walton. Decades before joining the cast, Geer had been blacklisted during the Hollywood Red Scare of the 1950s for his political activities and associations, effectively locked out of film and television work for years. Rather than disappear, he spent that exile performing outdoor Shakespeare and eventually founded a botanical theater in Topanga Canyon, California, that continues operating in his name to this day. When the Waltons brought him back into the mainstream, audiences were unknowingly watching a man whose real endurance mirrored the folksy resilience his character preached about on screen. His death forced the writers into an unusual position. Rather than quietly recasting or writing Grandpa out with a vague excuse, they folded his passing into the Walton family's story itself, allowing the characters, and by extension the audience, to mourn openly. Co-star Ellen Corby, who played his on-screen wife Esther, had developed a real friendship with Geer during production, and multiple retrospectives on the series describe her as deeply shaken by his death, a loss that arrived while she herself was already fighting to recover from a serious health crisis of her own. That health crisis had begun 2 years earlier, in 1976, when Corby suffered a stroke severe enough to threaten her ability to continue acting altogether. The stroke left her with impaired speech and mobility, forcing the production to write Grandma Esther's absence directly into the storyline rather than pretend nothing had happened. It was an unusually honest choice for a network drama of that era, one that treated illness as something to be acknowledged rather than hidden. Corby spent months in recovery, relearning basic speech patterns before she felt capable of returning to a television set at all. When she did come back, viewers noticed something different in her performance, a rawness and vulnerability that hadn't been present before, the natural result of an actress who is, quite literally, rebuilding herself in front of the camera. She continued in a reduced role for several more seasons, a decision that reflected sheer determination rather than full recovery, since her health never fully returned to what it had been before the stroke. Eventually, the physical demands of consistent filming became too much, and her presence on the show diminished further. Though she remained connected to the project, she clearly considered a second family. Corby's story, more than almost any other cast members, blurred the boundary between fiction and reality, turning Grandma Walton's on-screen frailty into an unintentional documentary of one woman's real fight to keep working. Richard Thomas, who played the show's narrator and central character John Boy Walton, made a very different kind of decision, one rooted not in illness, but in identity. After 5 seasons carrying much of the show's emotional and narrative weight, Thomas chose to leave following the 1976-77 season. He has explained in numerous interviews over the years that his departure had almost nothing to do with conflict on set and everything to do with the fear of being permanently boxed in by a single role. Thomas had trained seriously in theater before television made him famous, and he worried that remaining much longer would make it impossible for audiences or casting directors to see him as anything other than John Boy Walton. There was also an intensely personal dimension driving his choice. In 1975, Thomas and his then-wife Alma Gonzalez became parents to quadruplets, an extraordinary and demanding life event that made the grueling schedule of a weekly network drama nearly impossible to sustain alongside raising 4 infants at once. Thomas has spoken candidly about prioritizing his role as a father during those years, a decision that cost him the security of a hit show but one he has never publicly regretted. CBS attempted to soften the loss by recasting the role with actor Robert Whiteman, but audiences largely rejected the substitution, not because Whiteman's performance lacked merit, but because John Boy's voice, both literally as narrator and emotionally as the show's moral center, had become inseparable from Thomas himself. He would eventually return to the role in later television reunion movies, proving that his exit had been about timing and personal necessity rather than any lasting rift with the production. Michael Learn's exit followed a similar internal logic, but arrived from an entirely different motivation. As Olivia Walton, the family's steady, endlessly compassionate mother, won 3 Emmy Awards and became, for many viewers, the emotional anchor of the entire series. Yet in interviews conducted well after her departure, Learn has been remarkably direct about. Mother simply couldn't offer within the format the show had established. Rather than have Olivia vanish without explanation, the writers built a storyline around her contracting tuberculosis and being sent away for treatment, giving Learn's exit a narrative logic that felt organic rather than abrupt. Her full-time departure came near the end of the 1978-79 season, though she returned periodically for guest appearances in later years, evidence that her choice had been about creative restlessness rather than any falling out with the cast or producers. Losing Olivia so soon after losing Grandpa Zebulon meant the show had, within a remarkably short span, lost 2 of its central pillars, forcing the writers to lean more heavily on the family's remaining members to carry the emotional load the elder characters once shouldered. What separates the Waltons from so many long-running dramas is how little of this turnover stemmed from the kind of ego clashes or salary disputes that typically dominate entertainment reporting. Ralph Waite, who played family patriarch John Walton throughout nearly the entire run, remained deeply committed to the project, later reflecting in interviews on how personally connected he felt to the show's portrayal of working-class dignity and provision, themes that resonated with his own complicated upbringing. The younger cast members, including Judy Norton as Mary Ellen, John Walmsley as Jason, Mary McDonough as Aaron, Eric Scott as Ben, David W. Harper as Jim Bob, and Cami Codler as Elizabeth, stayed with the production through most or all of its run, growing up quite literally in front of the camera in a way few television families before or since have replicated. Their consistency became the connective tissue holding the series together even as its foundational figures were reshaped, one after another, by circumstances entirely outside anyone's creative control. Series creator Earl Hamner Jr., whose own Depression-era Virginia childhood inspired the show, spoke in later retrospectives about how each real-life change forced the writing staff to lean even harder into the show's central theme of endurance, a mirror of the very hardships the fictional Walton family had been created to survive in the first place. It's worth remembering just how different the professional landscape was for television actors in the 1970s compared to today. There was no streaming residual system offering long-term financial cushioning, no viral resurgence, waiting on social media to revive a career after stepping away from a hit show. When Richard Thomas chose fatherhood over another season of narration, when Michael Learn chose the uncertainty of creative reinvention over the comfort of a beloved role, when Ellen Corby chose to keep working despite a body that hadn't fully recovered, and when Will Geer's own life simply reached its end while cameras were still rolling around him, each of these moments carried genuine risk with no guaranteed safety net beneath it. These weren't calculated career moves dressed up for a magazine profile. They were the decisions real people make when forced to weigh identity, health, family, and personal meaning against the undeniable pull of continued fame and financial security. Decades removed from its original broadcast, The Waltons endures not in spite of these departures, but in some strange way, because of how transparently the show and its cast handled them. Viewers who grew up watching John Boy climb the mountain with his notebook in hand, who found comfort in Grandpa's stubborn wisdom, who leaned on Olivia's steadiness during hard weeks of their own, and who took quiet strength from Grandma's refusal to give up, were never simply watching skilled actors deliver lines. They were watching real lives intersect with fictional ones so closely that the line between the two nearly disappeared. Richard Thomas went on to build the celebrated stage and screen career he had hoped for when he first stepped away, eventually returning as one of American television's most respected veteran performers. Michael Learned found the creative complexity she'd been chasing across decades of subsequent theater and film work, proof that her departure had been an act of artistic honesty rather than abandonment of a role she supposedly should have cherished forever. Ellen Corby's determination to keep working after her stroke remains one of the quieter, more courageous chapters in television history. A reminder that some of the most powerful performances happen when an actor is simply fighting to keep showing up. And Will Geer's life, cut short during production but rich with decades of principled resistance before it, gave the series a gravity and depth that few family dramas before or since have ever managed to earn. In the end, none of these actors left Walton's Mountain because they stopped caring about the story or the family they had helped build on screen. They left because life, in its unpredictable and often unfair fashion, asked something different of each of them. Illness arrived uninvited. Death arrived without warning. Ambition pulled some toward new creative horizons, while love for newborn children pulled others back toward home. What remains all these years later isn't a story about a beloved show quietly falling apart behind the scenes. It's a story about people who gave everything they reasonably could to something far larger than any single performance and who ultimately walked away, each in their own time and for their own deeply human reasons, not because the mountain stopped meaning something to them, but because their own lives, just like the Walton families, demanded to be lived honestly, wherever that honesty happened to lead them next.